Welcome, Internet, to a psychologist's casual review, and today we're going to be reviewing Daniel Widlöcher's Metapsychology of Meaning. Here's the book. Here we go. So before we begin, we're going to have to talk about what is metapsychology, because it's not a word that's invented by Widlöcher. It's a word that basically has been coined by Freud. And what it means, very succinctly, very quickly, it basically means a fairy of the fairy. It's meta-psychology. It's beyond psychology. The idea here is to organize the psyche in processes that are both conscious and unconscious, meaning that since that we don't necessarily understand, and since that we do not necessarily know consciously, Freud tries to put them in a certain frame. That frame he calls meta-psychology. Meta-psychology is something that has been quite abandoned nowadays. I mean, at least pure meta-psychology, even though everyone kind of fits in somewhere in it. But the idea is basically you don't need to use it to be a good psychologist, at least a good psychodynamic psychologist. You don't need to use it to be a good psychoanalyst. So in a way, that's what he points out at the start of the book, Widlöcher, is that basically psychology and psychoanalysis have moved forward, and different schools kind of pay respect, but at a very, very distant and often hands-off point of view towards Freud's metapsychology. But Widlöcher here is interested in what it has become and how it can still be useful. In a way, it's very funny because it's called Metapsychology of Meaning, but I felt it was more, what is the meaning of metapsychology, rather than what does meaning mean in the metapsychological system. I mean, I don't know if I'm clear, but basically the idea is, what is metapsychology and where are we at right now, or at least when he wrote it in the 80s. And the very interesting thing I felt was basically he goes through every person that has made an impact through metapsychology. For example, he talks about Freud, yes, and Freud's the big influence in psychoanalysis even today, but he's also going to go through the motions of talking about Melanie Klein, Lagache, which is a French author, also Esler of the New York Psychoanalytic Institutions, which all of that is incredibly interesting. However, one thing you should really understand is that he's going to go deep into it, meaning that he's not there for the layman. He's clearly here for the professionals that really want a clear understanding of what is the metapsychology, because here he's going to talk about feelings, about how they connect with thoughts that themselves connect to actions. Is a thought connected to an action? Is an action a thought already? Is the fact of thinking of something already an action within the mind? All of those things are questions he asks, and he tries to provide an answer through analyzing three main topics: anxiety within the metapsychological system, identification, and the relationships with objects, meaning other people, the mother, the father, teachers, etc., etc. And how all of those intricacies come together, and basically what it all means. And so he starts off, for example, with anxiety, talking about how Freud, there was an irreconcilable aspect of Freud of like, is anxiety a signal for something like fear could be, or is it more deep, that it's more of a unconscious tension with the conscious mind, and that the anxiety is something that's symbolic of that conflict. For example, he doesn't give that example, but just for you to understand, basically what he means by that is basically that, let's say you're anxious about a leak, right? Well, the thing is, on the face of it, you might think it's because it's going to create some kind of problem, and it does. But Widlöcher and Freud would argue that yes, but, and that's the big but, it's also because unconsciously there's something about that leak. Like, for example, it can be anything really, depending on the person, but let's say in our fictitious example, that leak might represent a fear of losing something, of something going beyond one's control, that the destruction and the brokenness will become too overwhelming, that there might be a flooding. And that would not be within the conscious reach, but that unconscious aspect would still pressure the conscious mind, even if the conscious mind pushes it away. And so that is something that's very interesting. But Freud also says that might be a real signal of alert. So therefore, there's always a tension within the fairy. Is it a fairy of alert and like something we should be worried about, or is it a manifestation of an internalized conflict? And all of that is not necessarily clear with Freud. And so he goes also into Klein, how for Klein, it's directly in a mental, in a personal. It's not necessarily to do with an external object. It's just that the external object reawakens the fear we have, and how the infant directly starts with a fear, an innate fear, and that innate fear is always with us. And I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's really for you to just get the idea and see if it's something you would be interested in. He also then goes into the idea of identification. So very, very quickly, he makes the distinction, Widlöcher, that there is imitation and identification. There can be some crossing, but they're not the same. Identification is a much more subtle, both unconscious and conscious process in which the individual is gonna, in a way, start taking traits, start idealizing someone else. And that is the whole question of the ideal that he also spends a lot of time talking about, is that basically imitation is an action. Identification is a way of being, in a way. And that I found that very, very interesting within his book, and how detailed it was, because as I said, I'm really oversimplifying it for you to understand it, and even for myself, because there's a lot of very, very complicated ideas in this book. And I don't think that I'm doing it really justice, but I still wanted to talk about it because it does give you some kind of frame for much more complicated issues. And that's what it is. Because it's not going to be usable with patients, because you're never going to talk metapsychology with patients, because it's not meant for that. It's meant for the professional, so that you have some kind of guideline. Because he also, and that I find that, at least personally, the most interesting part of the book, he talks about the drives. So for you that don't know, the drives are states in which basically it becomes push to do something. I'm really oversimplifying it, but it's really to give you the main idea of it. In English, for a long time, it was translated by instincts, which, according to modern translation, is the wrong word. And having studied in France, it's true that we never use instinct. We use the word pulsion, which really means drive. It's something that pushes, in a way. It's like something that just pushes through the conscious and the unconscious mind to be to happen, for the drive to happen. And those drives, he really goes into very detailed aspects of them, because as you might know, Freud had the life drive and the death drive, eros and thanatos, even though I've never heard a psychoanalyst say that aloud, eros or thanatos, but those are the ideas, basically the two drives. One seeks life, happiness, establishment, basically, and the other one seeks destruction, violence, and so on and so forth, all the negative feelings. And even though I think that personally the dichotomy is not that real, I mean, is there really a life drive? Is there really a death drive? I mean, I do believe that there is something of aggression that might come through and destroy us. That's not to say there's no self-destructive tendencies. There are, and I think that those things need to be analyzed and brought into the conscious mind, but that's not really what I was trying to get to. Is that I don't think that there is a clear cut between both of them. I think there is kind of mingling in between both, that something can be life-driven but backed by a death drive, and something that apparently is death-driven can be backed by a life drive, and that it's much more subtle than that distinction that Freud makes. Anyway, I'm getting myself lost, as often are. The idea that you have to keep in mind with this book is that it's really an in-depth look. It's not meant for the layman, and if you're a layman, that might not interest you, or at least you might be very, very lost. And this isn't the case with some other books where even if you're a layman and you're really, really determined, you can make it through. If you're a layman and you're really determined, this is going to be a nightmare, because he really, really does not necessarily explain the fairy before he explain the gist of it. He doesn't really break down everything. For example, if you don't know what a drive is, as I've told you, if you did not know that, if you come to the chapter of drives, he's not going to give you a clear example. He's just going to go right in and just present all of his ideas, which are incredibly interesting, but incredibly hard, even for someone that's been trained in those arts, so to speak. So it's really a good book if you're interested in really the subtleties. But you have to understand that it's going to be a hard read also for everyone. And I don't think that because it's a hard read, it takes away from it. On the contrary, I think that there was no way of making it more easy, because when you think of it, how do you explain that the fact that a drive transforms into a thought that then transforms into an action? And I mean, it seems simple enough when I say it like that, but in the reasoning, we're missing so many steps. Like, for example, how come a drive doesn't necessarily take its real appearance? Why does it hide? Because of the conscious mind. But then why is the conscious mind doing that? Because it wants to preserve itself. But then when you come to it, why does it want to preserve itself if it's not going to be satisfied with the result? And all of those questions are incredibly important, but they overly simplify in my application of it. This book does not oversimplify it at all, and it really goes in deep. But that deepness is not for everybody. But I still, nevertheless, found it passionately interesting. And there's also another thing that I really liked about these ideas of drives, because it does put into perspective the mistakes that Freud made, which for those of you that don't know, it's something that's kind of a big no-no in psychoanalysis. Yeah, we know that Freud made mistakes, but we're not going to go there. And he's not afraid of going there when he thinks that Freud has made mistakes. For example, he does say that, like, when Freud talks about the death drive and how they are linked with aggressive tendencies, he puts them in the idea that it's basically body-based. Freud is very body-based. Like, for example, sex drives are obviously body-based, and he says that aggression is body-based in the muscles. However, Widlöcher points out that this is absurd. I mean, for example, is like voyeurism like based on some drive that comes from the eyes? And he says, no, it's not. And Freud made a terrible mistake when he tried to just body base it. It's not to say there's no body inclinations or something that's in the body, but it goes way beyond just the body. It's something that comes into the psyche, and it's not necessarily just the body, then we build on the psyche, then we build onto the action. It's not that. It's something much more subtle that might be correlated but is not caused, right? That might, anyway, complicated stuff. But it's very interesting, and I really like that idea that he was not afraid of saying that what he felt, and he is very anti-ego psychology, meaning if you're very into it, you're not going to have a good time, because he doesn't like it, and he's very open about it. And what I found very interesting in this book is the diversity. Like, it really paints a picture that some people feel that psychoanalysis is basically dead, it hasn't gone beyond Freud. And even though I do agree that we are very, very reliant on Freud, it paints a picture that no, there is all the psychoanalysis that did a lot of great stuff, even in terms of meta theory, meaning theory that's not even supposed to be applied to patients, and I find that wonderful. It's just like thinking for the sake of thinking, enjoying the process of thinking for the sake of thinking, trying to find the ultimate answer with the tools of psychoanalysis, and I find that great. I love that. I mean, I'm all for that, but just know that, well, I mean, you're not going to be using it anytime soon with any of your patients/clients. We're not into that. And if you're really into trying to at least come up to some form of like refinement, because I feel that the truth, this is a whole other discussion, but is unattainable. But Widlöcher tries to go forward and to go as far as one could go with the system of metapsychology. So, I mean, if you're really into seeking meaning, not in that existential way, but in that very concrete, practical way of how does a process thought go through, how does a drive turn into a thought that then turns into an identification, how does the Oedipus complex fit into all of this, how does a psychotic break fit into all of this? This is the book for you. I hope you liked it. At least I had a wonderful time reading it, even though I had to reread certain passages. So, anyway, if you want to partake in the discussion, please feel free to leave a comment. And I'll see you in the next one. See ya!